Hi, everyone. If this is your first time joining us virtually, welcome. If it isn't, welcome back. And thank you for joining us again. We are working hard to provide you with a new virtual program each week. Next Thursday, we will be hosting our first virtual date night. We will be making a sensual 18th century chocolate candy recipe together from our kitchens with food historian Joyce White. So check out our website and social media for the latest virtual programming from us here at the Maryland Historical Society. I am one of your hosts, Margot Copera, Public Programs Manager at the Maryland Historical Society, and this is my partner, Martha Osterbiel, the museum's Community Engagement Manager.
Hi again. Margot and I want to thank you all for joining us today, especially our members. As we've said before, our members are the backbone of our museum and our library, and it's because of their support that we're able to produce this type of virtual programming while we're social distancing at home. If you're not a member, please consider joining with us today. We're offering a special membership promotion for new members. You can join the Maryland Historical Society as an individual for $25. Normally $55, or as a family for $35. It's normally $70. And we'll communicate a special membership link to you in a follow-up email after the program.
That's right. And for our program today, as some of you may know, we are utilizing Zoom webinars. So in an effort to keep everything running smoothly and to have an amazing live experience with you, your audio and video capabilities have been removed.
We still hope that you will engage with us throughout the program by using the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. By clicking on the three dots above the text box, you can choose who to send your message to. So give it a try. Type in your first name and please tell everyone where you're watching from today.
Okay, so we also encourage you to ask questions for our guests and for us at any time during the next hour by clicking the Q&A icon, also located at the bottom of your screen. And a box will appear and you can type in your question. We'll select several questions for our guests today to answer during the program and also at the end of our talk.
We wanted to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be made available for you to rewatch in the next few days. We'll communicate the release of the video to you in a follow-up email and through our social media outlets.
Okay, now you might have noticed a little shift in what you are wearing lately. Perhaps your traditional work shoes are getting a little dusty in your closet. The thought of wearing your favorite necklace that you frantically searched for while you have 2 minutes to get into your car has now been buried somewhere. It was wherever it was left 3 months ago. So we're finding ourselves rapidly adjusting from what were normals to adapting what is today, realizing that in the middle of a crisis, fashion is responding to and reflecting the changes in people's everyday lives. Victoria Pass is a specialist in visual culture, particularly in areas of design and fashion, and her research considers the history of fashion culture in the 20th century, but approaches the many elements of visual culture as part of a network of visual representations, such as how something appears in magazines, newspapers, and how it exists in many forms and contexts. Vicky's writing has also appeared in many magazines, and she is the current president of the Design Studies Forum, an affiliated society of the College Art Association. She just concluded the school year at MICA, where she teaches Fashion in the Avant-Garde, History of Modern Design, and Modernism and After. Vicky received her BA in Art History from Boston University, her master's degree in Art History from the Art Institute of Chicago, and her PhD in Visual and Cultural Studies from the University of Rochester. Vicky is a local Baltimorean who does not approve of buying cheap shoes. She bakes cupcakes and has been known to embroider and can normally be seen wearing a replica vintage 1922 red lipstick on her Zooms. Welcome to our program today, Vicki. And in case you all are wondering where Martha and I are coming, and Vicki are coming from today, we're in your apartment. Right, Vicki?
Yes, you are in photos of my apartment. Thank you all so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thanks so much to everyone who's joining us from near Baltimore and far away. It's such a privilege to get to talk to you all and to share some ideas with you all. So I wanted to ask you all, since you all are participating in the chat, which is so fun to see, if you all are dressing differently now. Have you all changed what you're wearing now that we're, most of us, if we're lucky enough, are working from home? Maybe we're going outside a few times. So I'd love to know what you all are wearing, how things are changing. I'm seeing people talking about being casual, being comfortable. I know for myself, I've been dressing more casually than I usually do. Leggings, yes, yoga pants are life, definitely. I'm seeing that elastic, elastic waistbands for sure. What is a bra? Yes, that's a good question. There was a great article in the New York Times about that a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, athleisure, pajamas. And I had started thinking about this when we first kind of stopped, at least for me, I stopped going into work, into campus, and started broadcasting my classes from right here in my home office. And changed the way I dressed. For one thing, not usually wearing shoes. I did put shoes on for you all, and if you follow me on Instagram, you can see them. But I think our fashion has changed a lot. I'm seeing people also mentioning lighter weight clothing, wearing no lipstick. Some people wearing makeup for Zoom. As Margot mentioned, my lipstick has become a kind of constant on my Zoom, although it's a lot harder to wear under a face mask. So I've been thinking about these things. Yeah, no purses, no jewelry, these accessories that are kind of falling away, and how we might see some permanent changes, maybe even some changes, fingers crossed for the better, in terms of fashion, as a result of this crisis. And because I'm a historian, I did what I always do, which is to look back and think about what's happened in the past in previous moments of crisis, and how has that changed for good the way that we've dressed. So let me do the whole let me pull up my slides. So yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about moments in the past where a crisis has changed the way that we dress. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. Really just some moments from the past in which fashion has changed in response to things going on in the world. And for me, the way that I think about clothing in terms of its place in culture is that it's this kind of boundary between our bodies and the world. And so right now, when the world feels pretty fragile and our relationship with it feels more fraught than usual, clothing's function as a protective gear that we put on every day, I think has become even more important, and we're more aware of it. It's not just the thing that we put on to make ourselves kind of visible in the world. And that's what Kaja Silverman, one of my kind of favorite scholars in theorizing this, is talking about. But it's also something that protects us from the world. And now that we're trying to protect ourselves from these, teeny tiny invisible particles, how does that change the ways that we use clothing? We've seen some interesting creative ideas coming out of this moment. So one of my favorite, which was shared with me by some of my colleagues in the microfiber department, were these hats that were made by elementary school students in Hangzhou, China. And they're actually based on historic headwear from the Song Dynasty. The myth, I don't know how true it is that the emperors in the Song Dynasty required their officials to wear these hats with these sort of long projections from them so that they couldn't gossip. They couldn't get close enough to whisper in court. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great story. But you can see these school children made their own versions of these hats to give them a visual sense of what 6 feet apart is. So, and there, I don't know, maybe you all saw the viral pictures in Germany of people with like pool noodles on their heads and things like that. Here's one of my favorite ideas from fashion history. We could bring back the crinoline. And that would give us a kind of natural borderline. The cage crinoline, which was popular in the mid-19th century, very much mocked, as you can see in these images, but did actually serve to create space. And there were actually a couple of accounts where women said that it was pretty handy to keep people, particularly annoying people, at bay. And I would guess annoying men at bay. I wanted to share a little bit about the history of the PPEs, the personal protective equipment that we're beginning to wear, because I thought it might be something of interest to you all. And when I started learning more about it, it was fascinating to me. My mom is actually an infection preventionist, so I guess I have like a kind of funny personal link to this history, and I was sharing this with her over the weekend. The man you see on the left here, Dr. Wu Lian-Tay, was a Malaysian doctor who was sent by the Chinese to help with the Manchurian plague in 1910. So this was before the influenza pandemic, which I think is the kind of popular association that we have with the beginning of masks as personal protective equipment. It turns out that actually in the West, surgical masks had been worn even before that. They were introduced in 1897. And Dr. Wu had studied in the West, he'd studied in Britain, and so he was familiar with these surgical masks. And as this outbreak was happening in Manchuria, and it was a really awful disease, and most of the prevailing wisdom of doctors at that point was that it was a bubonic plague, and it was spread by lice. By fleas. That turned out not to be true. And Dr. Wu realized this and noted that it was actually spread by the air, by airborne particles. Of course, no one believed him, as many doctors and infection preventionists can attest to. So no one believed him at first, but he said, listen, if we start wearing some masks, we might be able to prevent this. But he developed a much better mask for airborne prevention than the surgical masks that were very much like the ones now with that kind of gape at the sides, and were basically like glorified handkerchiefs. So he suggested masks like the one that you're seeing on the right-hand side, where you have layers of cotton held on by gauze. If anybody has seen the suggestion about using nylon stockings around your mask to create a better seal, that's essentially what he was using. And eventually it became clear that he was correct, that this was indeed an airborne disease, and these masks became ubiquitous among healthcare workers, but even among regular people in Manchuria to try to prevent the spread of disease. And there are some folks that think that the presence of images of those masks in the news accounts of the Manchurian plague were influential on decision makers who decided to try masks as a mode of prevention during the influenza pandemic of 1918. So here you can see a poster from Connecticut, but ones like these would have been present all over the country in the US, urging people to practice the same kinds of hygiene and infection prevention that we're being urged to engage with now, keeping the mouth and teeth clean, avoiding people that are coughing and sneezing, don't visit poorly ventilated places, warm, fresh air and sunshine, don't share your drinking cups, cover your mouth when you cough and sneeze. And I like, avoid worry, fear, and fatigue. So easy to do. Pandemic. But in any case, also to wear masks. I found some great images from papers in Baltimore, where I am. Here you can see a call out on October 2nd in the Sun paper that 20,000 influenza masks were wanted, and the Red Cross was calling on women to make them. Does this sound familiar? Masks are needed. There's no kind of government structure to do it. So instead, the Red Cross, a non-government organization, steps in, makes a call out just to regular women to gather and make these masks for men who were who were training to be soldiers, who were at training camps, because of course World War I is going on at this point, and the U.S. is engaged in World War I by 1918. And you can see on the left women who are making these masks in Baltimore by October 11th. So this really was how masks were being produced in this period. Very much like our own moment, there were different laws in different states, in different cities around wearing masks. Places like Seattle, where you were required to wear a mask on public transit. Masks were required in New York City, for instance. California, you can see some train conductors up on the top left, conductorettes. Actually, this was one of the jobs that women held in this period, wearing masks. And as with today, there were people that protested mask wearing. If you look at the newspapers from this time, it's pretty astonishing how similar the responses and reactions were. We also had stories of workers at department stores being enlisted to make masks, schools closing, rules being posted in newspapers. The Winnipeg Tribune, a Canadian newspaper, one of the Winnipeg shops, Liggett's, was advertising these medicated anti-flu masks. There's a terrific documentary, although it's a little sobering for right now, on the pandemic that American Experience, the PBS show, produced a couple of years ago. If you want to learn more, and one of the things that the oral histories in that point out is that people would put all kinds of medicinal things that they thought were medicinal into their masks to try to prevent infection. So I think that's what you see in that medicated anti-flu mask. So here are some images from a cartoon of people miswearing masks, which are pretty familiar images, I think, to many of us now. I like the guy who wears his mask over his whiskers. He knows where the flu moths are likely to park. And I should make comment too on the Popular Science, a mask with a hole in it so that you could smoke your cigarette while you wear your mask. Reminds me a bit of the hurricane mask that I saw, so that you can sip your hurricane cocktail while you're wearing your mask. So 100 years later, a lot hasn't changed. But in any case, the N95 mask, that is one of the most important pieces of PPE to prevent medical workers from getting sick, also has a totally fascinating history, which I wanted to mention here. There was a terrific article on this I think it was in Fast Company magazine, but if you Google history of the N95, you'll find it really easily. And there was also a really nice podcast, which I'd recommend, on NPR's Throughline if you want to learn more, particularly about this woman, Sarah Little Turnbull, a product designer, an industrial designer, who I want to know a lot more about. She managed to work her way up in industrial design at a time when there were very, very few women who were successful in that business. And she was working for 3M. And they had put her in the gift wrapped division, I suppose, because she was a lady, maybe she knew about ribbons or something was their suspicion. But she knew far more than that. And they were using non-woven materials to make those ribbons that you would stick on a package. And they were using polymers and kind of spraying them to create a webbing. And she pitched the company on extending their use of these non-woven materials. She basically wrote a list of 100 things she thought they should be trying to use these non-woven materials on. And she gave this pitch to the company, and they said, yeah, okay, we'll try it. she had been working with shoulder pads with non-woven material because she had some contacts in the fashion industry, and they said, why don't you work on a bra? Which to me actually sounds like a really perfect use of non-wovens. And so she worked on that. But at the same time, she unfortunately had a number of relatives that were in the hospital who she was going in and visiting and spending time with. And she was noticing the kind of gaping surgical masks and thought, like, surely there's a better solution than this. What about applying the non-woven material to this problem? And so she helped to create, and it should be said, in design, there's never really one person that makes something, always working in a team, but she helped to create this design for what's sometimes called the bubble surgical mask. And it turned out it couldn't block pathogens at that point. The technology they were using to make the non-woven material wasn't good enough, but they continued to develop it. And the first really important market for it was as a particle protection for people working in construction and jobs like that. And it was hugely successful because it was way lighter than like big respirators. And basically they were wearing gas masks at that point in mid-century. So this was a huge step forward, and the technology continued to develop. And the N95s, as some of y'all might know, I know a lot of you all listening are makers, are used by folks still as particle protection, and got good enough to be used in medical protection. So Sarah Little Turnbull, a woman who deserves to be better known in design history. So a nod to her here. As in the past, we have people using all different kinds of solutions outside of the medical fields for masking. Here are some of the political figures of the day in the Senate, wearing various versions of masks expressing personality. I particularly like Nancy Pelosi's color coordination with her silk scarf solution, some patriotic ones. Tim Kaine favors a tie-dyed scarf, perhaps his roots as a baby boomer. But there's also been some fashion suggestions for masks. And I want to nod to a couple of creators local to me in Baltimore. Sarah Autry, who her image was on the promo for this talk. She runs a vintage shop here called Get Sharded Vintage and has been making some really cool masks to make this protective equipment more fun and expressive, with fringe and things like that, and interesting fabrics. And you can Google her up and find her website if you're interested. Also, Afro Threads, another great local brand, is producing masks with beautiful textiles that they source from Africa, which is part of their regular business. And a couple of other high-end designers that I found, including Maryland's own Christian Siriano. Hopefully, I hope folks, especially those of you all who are local, will be able to come to the Historical Society and see the exhibition, Spectrum of Fashion, there once the museum reopens. And there's a beautiful piece by Siriano there. He has turned his studio into fully into mass production, making PPE for medical workers, usually workers who aren't working directly with patients. So social workers, for instance, who are pictured on the bottom left, who are wearing them. And this has become his main output at the moment. His fashion masks are being auctioned in support of this work. And I do want to note, as we've seen many designers and fashion houses turning to producing PPEs, it's important to keep in mind the labor that's actually making this equipment, and also some of the problems in terms of labor that have been happening right now. So a number of brands, and you can see some of them listed here, have broken contracts because of the of what's happening right now, and they've used these force majeure clauses in their contracts to not pay for products that have already been made. So factories, often factories that are in places like Bangladesh, which have already made clothing, are not being paid by these companies, and in turn the workers from those factories are not being paid. So wages have been stolen from workers. and workers are out of jobs. If they're making personal protective equipment, often they are not furnished with their own PPEs to keep them safe while they're working. InStyle recently posted an article about this. There's a lot of good writing about this. If you want to learn more, I'd suggest following the Garment Worker Center, which is out of LA and has been doing a lot of really important work to support garment workers who find themselves out of work, who don't want to return to work because of the dangers. Garment workers are usually packed into pretty poorly ventilated spaces. This is happening even in the US, so buying made in America does not guarantee that you are buying something that was made with fair labor. There's a lot of wage theft that happens, even in American-made garment manufacturing, and the Garment Worker Center has been organizing against this wage theft. Often people are paid by the piece, just the way they were in sweatshops back at the beginning of off the rack, ready to wear fashion in the 19th century. So the same problems are still very much with us. So always good to think about that. And there have been some good victories in the Pay Up Fashion campaign to get fashion brands to actually pay for garments that have been manufactured. But this is an ongoing issue. And one thing I hope comes out of this moment of crisis is maybe some more attention to garment workers and the essential role that they play in making medical equipment and in making our everyday clothing. And I hope that it will result in better labor practices and more awareness that there is somebody that's actually making all of the things that we wear, including the masks and including hospital gowns and things like that. Okay, so I'll get off my labor soapbox. But in returning to these moments of crisis and how fashion has changed, I wanted to work back and talk about World War I, which is, of course, the kind of moment when the 1918 pandemic happens. And World War I has a pretty substantial impact on the way that people were dressing. Fabric had to be conserved. Colors became much more somber. Partly because a lot of the synthetic dyes of the time were manufactured in Germany, so they weren't being shipped. And the kinds of elaborate dressing that had been part of the lives of people of the upper classes, think Downton Abbey, if you want kind of an image of that, where, you know, you dress for morning, you dress for afternoon, you dress for evening, that went out the window. People weren't really dressing for different times of the day as much anymore. It was much more difficult if you were wealthy to get people to be on your staff to help you dress, because they were much better paying jobs doing war work. So these really shifted and changed the way that people dressed. Another thing that happened is that uniforms that men were wearing who were soldiers who were fighting in the war were actually a lot more comfortable than the kind of slim suits that were fashionable in the period. So that started to shift and change some of the ways that people were dressing in the moment. And you can see some of those uniforms in these images. It also represents this kind of shift politically and also sartorially from leaders appearing in uniforms and regalia, aristocratic leaders. You know, one of the results of World War I is that many of the aristocracies in Europe fall. And so here you can see an image of the Prussian king Wilhelm I being named German emperor back in 1870. And in newspapers in 1919, when the peace agreement was being signed, people were actually noting how different that scene in 1870, which also happened in the Palace of Versailles, which is where the peace agreement that ended World War I was signed, how different that scene looked. And you can see that really vividly, I think, in the comparison of the painting at the top here with this photograph of the leaders of the Allied forces meeting here in their suits, which don't look that different from the kinds of business suits that, that men still wear now. So there's a real shift in terms of how leadership is projected at the end of World War I in terms of fashion. One of the other garments that became popular in World War I and beyond is the trench coat. You've maybe not thought about that name, but the name trench coat actually comes from the trenches of World War I. They were manufactured and designed to be comfortable clothing for people, for the men who were in the trenches. If you know World War I at all, you know that the trenches were pretty wretched places to be. They were wet, they were cold, and so the trench coat was this long belted coat that was waterproofed and was designed really for practicality. And you can see in these ads from Burberry's, which is one of the companies that lays claim to creating the coat first. The truth is we don't really know. It was definitely British. It's definitely a British thing, but there were a couple other people who have taken credit. Aquascutum was another company, as well as a tailor named John Emery, who patented a rainproof technology in 1853 that was used by soldiers in the Crimean War. So as with anything in fashion, you can't really say one person invented it, but it certainly comes out of this moment in World War I when it, fully becomes the kind of the shape of the trench coat. The at the sleeve, you would have had a band that you could tighten to keep the rain out, and the belt also helped to keep the rain out and keep it sort of on your body, even if it was windy. And there were flaps on the shoulders. If you've ever wondered what those are for putting your gloves and your flat cap so that you could have them handy. And you can see in the ad on the left that they're on the belt. You could attach, your service revolver and, first aid kit and the other kinds of equipment that you would need for yourself. The trench coat also becomes a kind of unisex garment after the war. Greta Garbo, who you see here in the film, A Woman of Affairs from 1928, is often credited with helping to popularize the trench coat for women. But even before she wore it in the late 20s, a lot of women's fashionable clothing in the war years and afterwards was really based on men's uniforms. So you can see that influence even before, and you can see some Burberry overcoats advertised in the 1920s for air travel down in the bottom. So men, when they got out of uniform, tended to dress in a more casual way than they had before the war. And here are just some images to give you a sense of that. Fads like Oxford bags, these really baggy trousers in the 1920s, as well as the big raccoon coats that men wore, were started by college students, so hence Oxford bag. So colleges became a site for fashion innovation in this period. There's a terrific book called Dress Casual, Deirdre Clemente. If you want to learn more about that history, it's fascinating. And you can see sweaters and +4s worn by some men working at Walt Disney, including Walt Disney himself up there on the top left. These men are not golfing, they're at work, but they're wearing casual sports clothes at work. And I love this photograph by Richard Samuel Roberts from 1931 of two gentlemen in very casual and very cool clothing, this beautiful shawl-collared sweater that the man on the right has, and the cap, and then the fedora, which also comes into fashion in this period on the man on the right with his vest and tie. So more options in a sense for men, and the use of sports clothes, not just for, playing hockey, as you see in the Sears catalog on the left, but just for, kind of everyday activities. In terms of women's fashion, I think this National Savings Committee poster from the UK says it all. To dress extravagantly in wartime is worse than bad form. It's unpatriotic. So there was a sense that women needed to kind of dress according to the time and meet the moment with what they were wearing. There were many women who went into uniform, of course, women who became nurses, ambulance drivers, and the kinds of uniforms that they were wearing, which you can see in the pictures on the right side of this image in the slide, were very similar to the clothing that became fashionable for women who might not have been working in these fields. Another interesting element too in this history is that a lot of particularly upper class women who might end up working as nurses would have their own uniforms made up at their tailors or dressmakers. And so I think that's part of how this kind of exchange happens between uniforms for women and civilian clothes for women. This is one of my favorite images on the left from this period of a woman named Hilda May in a Chanel ensemble on her scooter in 1917. So you can see the ways that that kind of standard, simplified sort of uniform of almost a kind of sailor-inspired shirt, kind of tunic over a skirt, far less, poof and less fabric being used, shorter skirt lengths to make it easy to ride your motor scooter or your bicycle or whatever your transport was, become really popular in this period. And these kinds of garments would have been reproduced in the US, as you can see in this sketch by Max Meyer, who was a US-based essentially copy house that was copying French fashion, which was very typical at the time. That's a sketch from the FIT collection. Women who went into the workforce, like munitionettes who manufactured munitions in the period, had to dress in really specific ways to keep themselves safe. A lot of the kind of propaganda posters of the time, like this one, These Women Are Doing Their Bit from 1916, which is a British one, show a kind of romanticized image of the munitionette wearing a skirt, kind of glamorous. The munitionettes did not wear skirts. They wore jumpsuits. They had to be very carefully made so that there was nothing that might spark an explosion, which was always a danger for women who were working in these factories. So coveralls were really important. Any metal could accidentally spark an explosion, not to mention forgetting like a match in your pocket. And so they didn't have eyes on their shoes, like the kind of grommets, that you would have for your laces, just small details like that, which became really important. If you're interested in the munitionettes, there's a really beautiful set of oral histories on the Imperial War Museum's website where you can actually hear from some of these women who worked in British factories, like the women that you're seeing on this slide, about what their life was like, how they were actually dressing, and what the job was like. So it's a really, really interesting moment. One of the other places where women were working in both Britain and the US was on farms to do agricultural work. So as men went off to serve in the war, there was a need for women to step in to do the vital agricultural work. So this is a story that should sound familiar. There's been a lot of news stories lately about farm workers and how that labor is going to be done right now, as it's more difficult for people to move around and to work safely. What's really interesting is in Britain, the Women's Land Army was an official, government associated organization that really was a kind of army. If any of y'all have watched the BBC, I think it's a BBC show, Land Girls, you know about the World War II incarnation of this, but it starts out in World War I. In America, it was a civilian organization operating without government support. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It was based on the British model, replacing the labor of men who were being shipped off to the front. But what's interesting is that it tapped into networks of suffrage activists. So women's suffrage doesn't come until 1920. So women who were working in suffrage had these extensive networks, particularly in colleges. College women out in the summer can go to the farm and do this kind of labor. So that's really precisely what happened. There were, from 1917 to 1919, 20,000 women were employed in 42 states, which is pretty astonishing for a kind of grassroots organization. And the leadership of the organization is actually Harriet Stanton Blatch, who is the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of those suffrage leaders. And so in addition to college students, there were also teachers who went to work on farms in the summer. In the US, they were called farmerettes. Originally, this was kind of disparaging to link them to suffragettes, but eventually it became a term of endearment. And you can see in these images in the Women's Land Army of America poster there, their clothes look a lot like the bloomers that the suffragettes wore in the middle of the 19th century, which I think is pretty interesting. But many of these women were really just taking like something from dad's closet or something from their brother or their husband's closet and putting that on to go out on the farm. And you can see that really clearly on that bottom image. So women are wearing trousers pretty extensively, as you've been seeing here in World War I, which was a pretty big deal. And they were being marketed both to women who were more sort of formally engaged in war work, but also to everyday women who were tending to gardens and farms and all kinds of things on the home front. And Vogue magazine in 1917 was noting this. They were, of course, showing higher end trousers for women like these, which seem far less practical than what the farmerettes were wearing, and often kind of tried to soften the manliness or the supposed manliness of trousers with these kind of quote unquote Oriental touches. And there's a long history, which I'm happy to talk more about because it's part of my area of research about trousers being kind of mitigated through references to the Orient, which is this fictional place, right? The Orient doesn't exist, but it's references to places like North Africa, to places in Asia, and so forth. And so you can see that very clearly in the image on the left with that caption, very Oriental and strangely enough, very French. So this was a way to suggest that these trousers were not being taken from men, or not from white men at least, but that they were being taken from other cultures. And it feeds into these ways in which fashion has tended to historically reinforce these white supremacist narratives that are also used to police lines of gender too. So it's a much more complicated history that I'm getting into here, but I want to at least share a little bit of that with you. But in Vogue magazine, 1917, they asked, after the trousers, what? The revival of the trouser skirt is hailed with mingled joy and fear by those who have hitherto worn skirts. Into what new fields will this garment lead us? Once over the stile and into the pantaloon, shall we ever be able to get back again? It is a serious question for serious consideration. Shall we even want to get back again? The war has led women into many a new pasture. Will it also lead into trousered freedom? So you can start to see the stakes that Vogue is suggesting with the trouser. It really is associated with freedom. And so that becomes scary, particularly for men who think, that freedom is going to come at the cost of their power. And so that's why these kinds of Orientalist flourishes become associated with the trousers. And even before this, if you know the designer Paul Poiret, of course, his trouser skirt, which they're alluding to there, was totally encased in this Orientalist fantasy, and he launched it with a party called the 1002nd Night Party, alluding to Scheherazade and so forth. So this is a long history that this is just kind of one moment in. Clothing, even before the war, had already been simplifying for women. And as with all of these moments, these changes don't happen overnight, but it tends to be that the war just pushes them forward and accelerates them. And that's the story with women's dress too in this period. Short haircuts, the bob haircut that we associate with the 20s, started before or on the eve of the war. Irene Castle's probably one of the first women to do it, as were bohemian women like Clara Tice living in Greenwich Village. It's totally not true that Chanel sparked the trend. Just by the way, one of the many myths about Chanel. If you want to know more about Chanel, you can please ask me in the question and answer. I'm happy to share more about her myths. But it wasn't her. It was women like Castle and Tice. And the war just accelerated these changes. If you imagine yourself working in a factory, it's probably a lot more practical to chop off your hair than to try to stuff it all up under a bonnet. So I think that probably helped to push some of these trends forward. Trousers do stick around, but in pretty selective places in the 1920s. contrary to what you tend to see represented in period pieces like Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries and things like that, although I love that show, but you know, the costumes are a little more advanced than they really would have been in the 1920s. Trousers tend to be worn at the beach pajamas, lounging pajamas in the house, on the tennis courts, although this ensemble that Lily de Alvarez is wearing on the left was pretty scandalous at Wimbledon because it wasn't a skirt, as she shows you, it was actually trousers. But sportswear for women becomes a lot more comfortable, a lot more utilitarian, and a lot more unisex, as you can see in that image from the cover of Life magazine. This was not the Life magazine that you might be familiar with. This was a kind of comic, satirical magazine that pre-existed the photographic magazine, which many of us are familiar with. And this question about trousers continued throughout the 1920s and 30s. Will it be trousers for women? Women like Marlene Dietrich, who freely adopted trousers, as well as Katharine Hepburn, were frequently talked about. And, you know, their adoption of trousers was seen as somewhat scandalous. And there were these constant questions of whether women would really fully embrace trousers. I'll show you how that kind of resolves after World War II. But meanwhile, the Depression intervenes in the 1930s. And what's interesting, I think, to observe is there's some real resonances in terms of some of the ways we're thinking now and some of the ways that people were thinking then. One thing that's worth noting, which I think is not immediately apparent to us, is that clothing was much, much more costly to people historically than it is to us now. Clothing is like rock bottom cheap right now compared to what it was. There's a number of factors to do with that, but labor and our undervaluing of labor is certainly one of them, and our sense of clothing being disposable, which I would say starts really in like the 1960s. That's that sort of direction of disposability in clothing. Before that, people really cared for their clothing in different kinds of ways, mended clothing much more. And many of you all, I know I'm preaching to the choir because many of you all are makers and are engaged with sustainability and fashion and design. But just to have a sense of this, Americans spent 13% of their income on clothing in 1901. And in 1997, which is a good while back now, they only spent 6%. So it was cut in half from 1901 to 1997. And I guarantee if I could find a similar statistic now, it would be even lower. What we spend of our income on clothing. So that has really, really changed. During the Depression, Vogue had a very interesting way of covering it and dealing with it. I mean, they were, I think, you know, and they kind of still are sort of hesitant to acknowledge the realities of the world in many ways, and they're usually late to the party. In the 1930s, they started to regularly have this column called Whispers to a Girl with Nothing a Year. And they were really about dressing on a budget. And I'll read you this one because I think it gives you a sense of the tone. There is a new fad now in the air. It has suddenly become chic to be poor. Secret scrimping is a thing of the past. The impoverished lady genteel is a dodo. Nobody bothers anymore to camouflage poverty. Quite the contrary. Conversationally speaking, you actually must suppress your riches in order to be in style. I'm so poor, I haven't a cent, our everyday boasts. Going to cheap shops is a fetish. Snooping at Woolworths is the latest indoor sport. The fashionable woman's jewels may come from Cartier's, but her gown is quite likely to be a gem from nowhere. She may eat squab off Crown Derby, but her cocktail glasses will probably be from a 5 and 10. Without a doubt, she will call attention proudly to both of these finds. And why? Because it has taken ingenuity to discover them. Because she has used her wits. Your poverty may be poverty in dead earnest, but it is up to you whether to be witty or dull. Obviously, Vogue wanted you to be witty in your poverty. And to help you along, they published these columns which gave tips in quite, they sometimes use dialect, which I'm still kind of trying to figure out like what they're trying to allude to here. But they're, you know, saying like, oh, you know, go to this counter and you can get a discount on this, or, you know, here's some cheap thrills for $1 that you can get at this shop, or, you know, you should spend your money on this and then, you know, buy something cheap in this area. So there's sort of tips for people who are trying to be thrifty. Of course, the women who were reading Vogue magazine were not the average American woman. This is a pretty specific upper echelon of society in the 1930s. For many people, just getting fabric to make clothing was a struggle. And in a lot of the photographs that document the Depression, many of them made by the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s, which is one of the New Deal projects that Franklin Roosevelt was behind, you can see that one of the materials that was used for garments in this period were feed sacks, flour sacks and sugar sacks, that held chicken feed and different kinds of agricultural materials. So we tend to think about those kinds of bags being made from like burlap. But if you think about flour, you can't contain that in burlap, right? Because it's all going to leak out. So they were actually like a pretty nicely woven cotton. These bags were made starting in the middle of the 19th century and started to replace barrels once you could easily commercially produce woven cottons and machine sew them and things like that. And from that period, we know that women were always saving this material and reusing it and repurposing it. But that ramps up in the 1930s. And the thing that changes, which you can kind of see from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, in a sense, is the girl on the left-hand side is wearing a dress that, as the caption says, is made from a meal sack. And if you look closely at that image, it's pretty plain. There's a little bit of a stripe at the top, which might have been on the bag. The girl on the right-hand side is also wearing a dress made from some kind of sack, flour, chicken feed, something like that. But you can see it has a lovely print on it. And this is because the feed companies and flour manufacturers all started to realize that women were actually reusing this material, and they could attract consumers by printing attractive prints on the bags that could then be repurposed. This begins in the 1920s, these prints being produced, and continues all the way through the 1950s. And you can see some of these kinds of designs here. I'll read you a description from this period of a woman using these bags. She says, after the bags were emptied, they were turned wrong side out and given a good shaking to remove all the dust possible. They were sewn with a stitch that if you get it started right, the string could be removed easily. The string was saved also. It was wound on an improvised spool, most likely an emptied wax paper roller. The bags at first were made from unbleached muslin with the name of the distributor and other information in large letters and bright colors on the front and large blotches of color around the letters. This could be removed if you had lots of patience and elbow grease. They were put in warm water to soak overnight with lots of octagon soap powder and maybe a little red devil lye. The next day they were removed from the soak and rinsed several times to remove excessive dye before they were scrubbed on the washboard using homemade lye soap, then boiled in the wash pot with octagon soap powder. After rinsing, they were soaked overnight in Clorox bleach to bleach them and remove any tinge of dye that might remain. After several rinsings to remove the Clorox, they were hung from the clothesline to dry. When dry, they had to be ironed. The finished product was a yard of white bleached muslin. So it's quite a process to go through to bleach out that flour sack or that meal sack to get yourself a yard of fabric. But that yard of fabric was incredibly valuable. And that's a description from a farm woman in North Carolina, by the way, in the 1940s. And she also remembered that the feed truck would come to their house every week, and women would look for the patterns they wanted so that they could collect enough sacks to, make a dress, because you might need multiple sacks to make a dress or to make a particular garment. Other things that were made from these included curtains, diapers for babies, all kinds of things were made, and of course towels for the kitchen. And for other home use. One of the first companies that began to sort of pioneer in this area is a company that started to print gingham fabric for their Gingham Girl flower. And I have no idea, but it just made me think about the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy in Kansas. And I wondered if there was maybe a connection between the costume designers designer Adrienne deciding to use a blue gingham for her dress in that film, and maybe this link to farm women using feed sacks and flour sacks to make their fabric. And so maybe the idea that, Auntie M had made this pinafore for her from a gingham girl sack of flour, a few gingham girl sacks of flour. But in any case, this was prevalent all over the place. And as the Depression hit, agents from the Farm Security Administration, as well as the USDA, began to go out into these rural communities and offer sewing classes and other kinds of workshops, what we would now call workshops, in home economics and home management for both adult women and for children, for girls in these areas. And you can see one of these classes here. The classes were segregated, but there were many African American women who participated in them. The WPA set up sewing rooms in cities and towns all across the country, not just in rural areas, but there were women who could go into those sewing rooms and use a sewing machine if they didn't have one. There were also people available, home economists, trained home economists, to give them advice on their work. And there were many sewing classes that were run out of those sewing rooms, as well as in these more rural areas through the USDA and through 4-H clubs. In 1933 alone, clothing clubs in Virginia made 10,000 garments out of sacks. This was hugely popular, and many women, of course, knew how to sew. It wasn't a skill they didn't have, but learning the more sophisticated skills of sewing was really important, and was the difference between making a really simple garment like the one you saw in that first little girl, and something more sophisticated like the dress the woman on the left is wearing and the two dresses the woman on the right is holding. There were home economists who were being trained, like the graduate students that designed this dress made out of flour sacks, and there were patterns specially produced to make these garments. And here you can see some more examples of the kinds of designs that were on these garments, or on these textiles, on the feed sacks, and a few of them that were in a migrant camp near Texas. And as I said, this continued into the 40s, of course, as fabric is running short during the war. There were still feed sacks available, flour sacks. There was still fabric for that. So that was an important source of fabric for many people. Also, it tended to be something that was bought. If you had enough feed sacks to make lots of clothing, you were probably pretty well off. So you might sell your feed sacks from your, large farm, your large chicken farm, say, to poorer women for a less expensive price than what they would have paid to buy new fabric. So it was a kind of women's economy too, in a really interesting way in this period. So during the Depression too, there was this interesting relationship between women and beauty and cosmetic products. And one of the sort of theories that comes out of the Depression is that cosmetics continue to be consumed in sort of high levels. By the 1920s, cosmetics were no longer seen as suspect. Women were always policed in their wearing of cosmetics, but women, especially women of color, of course, were policed in their use of cosmetics, but women were much more broadly adopting cosmetics. They were even putting them on in public. In 1933, Vogue proclaimed putting on lipstick in public had become one of the gestures of the 20th century. So this was a kind of important way in which women took up public space, were creative, enacted themselves as modern. And this remained true during the Depression. I think the ad on the left says this really clearly. A girl must seek safety as well as thrills. And so, safety is not buying the new dress, but thrills is buying a new lipstick. And so lipstick and cosmetic sales stayed strong during the Depression, as other sales fell. And they started to be written about in this really specific way, as being linked to kind of courage and resilience for women. Harper's Bazaar in 1937 famously published this story, The Red Badge of Courage. And they said, they're talking about all these different courageous gestures. And they said, for women now, it is putting on lipstick. When a woman has lost her lover, when a girl has lost her job, when a doctor has told his fatal news, when the luck is leaving, the dinner party flopping, the birth pains beginning, the scandal breaking, the storm striking, the other woman sailing by in triumph, the sudden streak of lipstick across the lips spells courage. And this continued to be the rhetoric in the 1930s, including in stories where women were being policed, women who were on relief for continuing to purchase lipstick and nail polish. Other women wrote in support of them saying, this is a red badge of courage. Women can't get jobs if they can't buy lipstick and take care of their hair and make themselves presentable. So these actually are essential products for women. Even in the 2008 recession, it was noted by Ronald Lauder of Estee Lauder that cosmetic sales stayed strong. He actually proposed this idea of the lipstick index in terms of economic downturn leading to more cosmetic purchases. And in World War II, this rhetoric continued of cosmetics as the red badge of courage. And I want to show you this wonderful image, which I'd seen a million times of this woman working on a dive bomber during World War II. And I'd never noticed she's got red nails and red lips. And I love the second photo, which I just found of her actually looking at the camera and smiling, where you can see that more clearly. So this was very much true of women who were war workers in World War II. There were efficiency experts who said this helped them to do their job better and supported these the using of cosmetics. Lockheed actually had like a little salon set up in their factory for women. So there were a lot of factories that recognized the importance of cosmetics for morale. And cosmetics were never rationed that much during World War II, in part because of this idea that, if you were asking women to devote themselves to the war effort, you had to give them some concessions. They couldn't buy new clothes, at least let them buy a new lipstick or a new nail polish. And that is one of the things that working women during the war spent their money on was cosmetics. The sales were very strong. Even women like Eleanor Roosevelt frequently had polished nails matching her lipstick, although she favored more pink shades than that bright red that many other women wore. And a lot of the ads talked specifically to this idea, this one talking about you're doing double duty, very similar rhetoric to what we hear now about, women's work never being done. And, the lipstick, as it says, an instrument of personal morale, helps to conceal her heartbreak, her sorrow, gives her self-confidence when it's badly needed, heightens her loveliness when she wants to look her loveliest. And this was very much a part of a lot of the propaganda images too, encouraging women to join the service of the lipsticked woman in the auxiliary territorial service poster for the British ATS, or a woman in an air raid precautions staff member applying lipstick. So this was part of the rhetoric of the war, and fashion and makeup companies got in on the game, marketing colors like Victory Red and so forth, that women like my grandmother on the left, Lillian, and family friend Phyllis Atkins, who you can see both here in uniform. They were both members of the Army Nurse Corps, could wear. And you can see Phyllis definitely wearing a great bright shade of lipstick and in trousers. So my grandmother Lillian, I haven't seen any photographs of her in trousers. She was an officer, so I assume her uniform requirements were a bit different. But Phyllis wears trousers as part of her uniform. The trench coat still there. That's my grandmother Lillian down in the bottom of this photograph, second from the right. So many women went into formal uniforms for war work in World War II, as well as more informal uniforms for factory work. And I have far too much to share as usual, so I feel as though I should stop here, because all of you lovely people probably have other things to do with your lives. But I would love to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was really phenomenal. I think everybody here was just, totally enraptured by your presentation. Before we get to audience questions, I just want to ask what your quarantine look has been.
Oh, well, it's usually been, if I have to be on Zoom, I tend to wear like a nice top, sometimes something with a print. So it's sort of interesting because you only get like a little bit up. But I like that I don't have to worry if like the back of my hair looks funny. Um, or if things are like flattering or anything like that, like anything up here is going to be flattering. Like who cares? It's kind of nice. You're kind of all brain, in a sense, which I like about this.
Absolutely.
So Vicky, like Martha said, there are so many fascinating topics of interest that you touched on today in the program. And so many of us watching have so many questions and want more information. But there's one topic that has come up, and actually specifically your research usually focuses on race and gender.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of questions about that coming from the program today. You talked about the sewing classes
Mm-hmm.
and the feed bags. One question that has come up from Tess she asks, are there historical records about fashion and garments worn by non-white women? I'm sure they were largely ignored in the media and advertising, but curious if there were different trends for different populations.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were different trends that are not logged as carefully as they are for white women because they don't exist in the same way in the sources. One source that I think is really terrific on this in terms of cosmetic trends is the book Hope in a Jar by Kathy Pice, which chronicles the rise of the cosmetics industry in the US. And she does a really brilliant job of documenting the African-American cosmetics industry, women like Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Turnbull Malone, and their stories are totally fascinating. Don't let the Netflix movie give you the wrong idea. There was just a Netflix movie that really heavily fictionalized that story, which is a shame because the real story is like even more fascinating. So if you're interested, there's both a biography of Madam C.J. Walker, which the Netflix show is based on, but took many, many liberties with. So it'd be worth reading that, or Hope in a Jar, which has several a lot of information about the cosmetics industry and differences between white cosmetics companies and African-American ones. Another source, which is something that I'm hoping to explore this summer a little bit more, is the WPA oral histories, which is where some of this information about feed sacks comes from. And I think that's a source where you would have seen a more diverse group, both racially and socioeconomically, being interviewed and talking about dress practices. And so I think that's a really like a rich, untapped resource for fashion historians to understand more about this period and how regular people actually dressed.
Another question in regards to that actually is about coming from Miss Gross. She is asking, how will the necessary population of facial coverings affect the stigma against facial covering by choice, such as burqas, especially since there are anti-quarantine protests that are fueled by different populations? Do you think there will be a cultural split?
I think that's a really good question. And one of the, I must confess, I didn't read the article, but a headline I breezed by, which also made me think about this question, was that there are certain places where burqas are not allowed. Like France has some laws against them, for instance, in certain places at least. As there are laws mandating mask wearing, I am curious what the negotiation of this is going to be, because France has a pretty complicated history and a history of racism enacted through these laws that are meant to keep people secular, quote unquote, there. That's how they enact their laws around religious freedom, which is very different than the way that we would interpret them in the US. And I do wonder if it's going to cause tension around those laws. I mean, there's hope that will help to eliminate those kinds of restrictions and allow people to wear what they like in terms of and wear what they're mandated to in terms of their religion. So yeah, I think it's a really important question to think about.
We also have a question from Stephanie. She's asking, how do fashion and fun or creativity square with a deadly pandemic? What role do they play emotionally or psychologically?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's one of the things that I sort of gleaned from my research, which is that, in all these moments of crisis, fashion still performs this kind of essential role for us, in that it's about us expressing who we are and how we feel in relation to the world and how we want the world to see us. And I know, just anecdotally from a lot of what I'm hearing from friends and people that I know, is that, putting on clothes, putting an ensemble together, if you're somebody who takes joy and pleasure in clothing and dressing, still brings joy and pleasure even, in this moment of crisis. And it might be one of the few things we can control, in the same way that the new lipstick might have been one of the few things someone could have afforded in the Depression. Putting together an outfit in the morning can sometimes be a kind of simple pleasure. So I think that for those of us who enjoy fashion and who like the process of putting together our kind of public selves in that way, I think it will still be important. And I just think it will change the ways we think about it, which is what I'm really hopeful for. I hope that it will change the way we think about how we're filling our closets, and perhaps we'll fill them with less. And we'll fill them with more intentional things, and we'll think a bit more about the labor of making our clothes and trying to make those clothes last longer, or taking some inspiration from the Depression and all the generations of women and men before us, but most especially women who took the care to mend garments, to remake garments, to refashion garments, and to take control. One of the stories I didn't get to was the new look from Dior, which was actually protested against by women who had been wearing shorter skirts and rationed fabric during the war. Dior in 1947 presents this, huge skirt and nipped in waist and much longer, and used yards and yards and yards of fabric. And there were many women who were still experiencing rationing, especially in Europe. Skyrocketing food prices all over in the US, and there were protests around that. And they said, hell no, we're not buying this new look. We don't want to wear longer skirts. We like shorter skirts. We like the silhouette we're wearing. It's comfortable. And they said no, literally, and actually protested it. There were clubs around the country called Little Below the Knee clubs. There was one right here in Baltimore. So, I think there is often tension between the ways that real people dress and the way that the fashion industry kind of conceptualizes the way we dress. And these moments are ones where that tension becomes more apparent, I think.
Vicki, this is just utterly fascinating, and there is a huge call for part 2 of this discussion by more than half of the participants, but I think this is a great place to end it. If your question was not answered today by Vicki, we will certainly get Vicki's answer offline and send that to you within the next week, as well as a copy of the video recording that we did today. Right, Martha?
Yep. Thanks everyone for joining us. And again, a very special thank you to you, Vicki. This was so wonderful. People are just going bonkers in the chat. And we're just so grateful that we have your friendship and your partnership, and you're able to share this wonderful wisdom and history with us. So thanks so much. Take care, everybody. We'll see you at the next virtual program. Take care.
Thank you all
Bye,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Be well.